President of the United States leaves office, the first in our 189-year history to do so by the route of resignation. Richard Milhous Nixon, having announced, as the whole world knows now, last night, that he was resigning, will leave the White House in a very short time now after a farewell meeting with his cabinet and the White House staff. They have gathered now in the East Room at the White House, and there the President will speak to them briefly. Then there will be a handshake farewell, we understand, a sort of a reception line in reverse, a farewell line, and then the President will move on out to the south lawn of the White House with his family, Mrs. Nixon and his daughters, Julie and Tricia, and their husbands, to board a helicopter to fly to Andrews Air Force Base. There, an Air Force plane will take him on out to San Clemente, California, and retirement as the President. He will leave the White House as President of the United States, but before his plane arrives in San Clemente, the resignation letter that by law he has handed to Secretary of State Kissinger will be opened, and that will formally mark the end of his presidency. That will be just before noon, and immediately thereafter, Gerald Ford of Michigan, who has been President Nixon's hand-picked vice president, picked 8 months ago when Spiro Agnew resigned. He will become the next president and take the oath of office at the White House. Earlier this morning, as Mr. Ford left his home in Alexandria, Virginia, he spoke with reporters.
Good morning, sir. Well, was it a good evening?
Well, I got to bed about 1:30 and got up about 5:45, so it was a short evening.
What are your feelings this morning as you prepare for this eventful day?
I think a feeling of sadness on the one hand and expectation to start to build on the other. It does strike me as a terribly heavy responsibility, which we're going to try and work on and do our very best.
The President talked last night of the heavy responsibilities that were going to be on your shoulders today. Do you feel those?
You can't help but feel that way.
Mr. Vice President, when Harry Truman had the office suddenly thrust upon him, he said that he felt like the stars and the moon and the planets had all fallen on him. How do you feel getting the same responsibility dumped on you?
I think that's a very apt description, and I can tell you better after noon today when it actually happens.
The Vice President, Mr. Ford, will become President at noon, as we have said. He's already hard at work, of course, in putting this new government together. The transition really began, we have been told, as early as Monday, when the Vice President became convinced that this day might fall sooner than he had anticipated, or that perhaps had not anticipated it falling at all up to the last few weeks at any rate. He began working at that time, we are told. And already this morning he met with a couple of his advisors to discuss transitional matters. One of his first major tasks will be to appoint a vice president. And then, for the first time in our history, we will have both a president and a vice president who have been appointed to office rather than elected. As a matter of fact, when Mr. Ford takes the oath of office at noon today, for the first time we will have a president who is not elected by the people, since Mr. Ford was appointed under the new 25th Amendment to the Constitution when the vacancy existed upon Spiro Agnew's resignation. Mr. Ford, however, will go into office with the best wishes of all of the party leaders, of course from his own party, but those from the Democratic Party as well. They have all overnight expressed great feelings of sympathy for the tasks he faces in trying to deal with the nation's disrupted economy and with some serious problems overseas as well. They all anticipate a honeymoon period, but of course the Democrats say they'll be looking very carefully at his programs. They are expected to be very conservative. That has been the Gerald Ford's history in 25 years in public life since he was first elected to the House in 1948, and his financial policies, fiscal policies, are expected to be even more conservative than Mr. Nixon's have been. He will follow the advice, we have been told, of Federal Reserve Board Chairman Arthur Burns and Paul McCracken, both conservatives who believe in austerity as a means to fight one's way out of spiraling inflation. Chief Justice Warren Burger flew back to the United States from Holland today to swear in Gerald Ford as president. He was in Europe on a planned 3-week vacation, and for him, as well as for so many others who are intimately connected with this event, either as participants at the White House or in Congress or among the press, his vacation was interrupted. So Justice Warren, Chief Justice Warren Burger will be there at the White House this morning. Dan Rather is outside the White House now and will be following these dramatic last moments of the Nixon administration along with us this morning. Good morning, Dan.
Over to Lafayette Park, which is directly across the street from the White House. We took a look back to the Executive Office building and could see any number of White House staff members, shoes shined, pants pressed, and most of them, I should say some of them, with their families with them, heading for the East Room, and these last few minutes with President Nixon. What this is about this morning in the East Room, which is probably the most famous room in the White House itself, with the possible exception of the Lincoln Room upstairs and the President's own Oval Office, the East Room where Abigail Adams used to hang her wash, where so many historic occasions have taken place in the history of this country. The White House staff members, the so-called little people of the White House staff, as well as those whose names have been in the headlines regularly, are to say goodbye to President Nixon. Just after that, the President will be saying goodbye to members of his cabinet, and then the President will be taking off from the White House South Lawn, over the Washington Monument, past the Lincoln Memorial, on his way to Andrews Air Force Base in suburban Maryland. What are you aware of President of his administration might be? This is, of course, the East Room setting. Mr. St. Clair, the President's attorney. Just to bring that last thought around, there's been a great deal of talk.
Dan, could I interrupt
Yes,
you just
surely.
a moment? We heard this morning that Mr. St. Clair has said that he will no longer be the President's attorney as of noon today. He is stepping out with the President's resignation.
Yes, no surprise there, Walter. It's also no surprise that Mr. St. Clair was tremendously shocked by what he learned when he learned about what was in the Monday release transcripts.
Dan, here
In the
is
East Room of the White House, pardon me, Walter, the President and Mrs. Nixon, I believe, are entering the room, yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States of America and Mrs. Nixon, Mr. and Mrs. David Eisenhower, Mr. and Mrs. Edward Cox.
This is a scene, Walter, that Richard Nixon, by my own fast count this morning, has done at least 150 times during the 2,000-plus days of his presidency. This will be the last time that he will do it as President of the United States. That was Dr. and Mrs. Henry Kissinger just a moment ago.
Cabinets over here.
tear in the President's eye.
Yes, for the first time during this week, Walter, there is.
We did hear Dan last night at the White House when he met with the leadership of the Congress. After a rather emotional talk to them, he broke down and cried, and the senators all then cried, we were told.
That shot just a moment ago, Fred Bizarre, to another of the President's lawyers. There's a marvelous picture. Defense Secretary Schlesinger, as usual, steaming on his pipe. The President and his family standing between portraits of George and Martha Washington. This lengthy standing ovation from members of the White House staff. Tricia, the President's elder daughter, standing at her mother's left.
Thank you. Well, members of the Cabinet, members of the White House staff, all of our friends here, I think the record should show that this is one of those spontaneous things that we always arrange whenever the President comes in to speak. And it will be so reported in the press, and we don't mind, because they've got to call it as they see it. But on our part, believe me, it is spontaneous. You are here to say goodbye to us, and we don't have a good word for it in English. The best is au revoir. We'll see you again. I just met with the members of the White House staff, you know, those that serve here in the White House, day in and day out. And I asked them to do what I ask all of you to do, to the extent that you can and are, of course, are requested to do so, to serve our next president as you have served me and previous presidents, because many of you have been here for many years, with devotion and dedication. Because this office, great as it is, can only be as great as the men and women who work for and with the President. This house, for example, I was thinking of it as we walked down this hall, and I was comparing it to some of the great houses of the world that I've been in. This isn't the biggest house. Many are, and most, and even smaller countries are much bigger. This isn't the finest house. Many in Europe particularly, and in China, Asia, have paintings of great, great value, things that we just don't have here, and probably will never have until we are 1,000 years old or older. But this is the best house. It's the best house because it has something far more important than numbers of people who serve, far more important than numbers of rooms or how big it is, far more important than numbers of magnificent pieces of art. This house has a great heart. And that heart comes from those who serve. I was rather sorry they didn't come down. We said goodbye to them upstairs. But they're really great. And I recall after so many times I've made speeches, they've been some of them pretty tough. You'd always come back, or after a hard day, and my days usually have run rather long, I'd always get a lift from them, because I might be a little down, but they always smiled. And so it is with you. I look around here and I see so many in this staff that, I should have been by your offices and shaken hands, and I'd love to have talked to you and found out how to run the world. Everybody wants to tell the president what to do. And, boy, he needs to be told many times. But I just haven't had the time. But I want you to know that each and every one of you, I know, is indispensable to this government. I'm proud of this cabinet. I'm proud of all the members who have served in our cabinet. I'm proud of our sub-cabinet. I'm proud of our White House staff. As I pointed out last night, sure, we've done some things wrong in this administration. And the top man always takes the responsibility, and I've never ducked it. But I want to say one thing we can be proud of. 5.5 years. No man or no woman came into this administration and left it with more of this world's goods than when he came in. No man or no woman ever profited at the public expense or the public till. That tells something about you. Mistakes, yes, but for personal gain, never. You did what you believed in. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong. And I only wish that I were a wealthy man. At the present time, I've got to find a way to pay my taxes. And if I were, I'd like to recompense you for the sacrifices that all of you have made to serve in government. But you are getting something in government, and I want you to tell this to your children. And I hope the nation's children will hear it too. Something in government service that is far more important than money. It's a cause bigger than yourself. It's the cause of making this the greatest nation in the world, the leader of the world. Because without our leadership, the world will know nothing but war, possibly starvation, or worse in the years ahead. With our leadership, it will know peace. It will know plenty. We have been generous, and we will be more generous in the future as we are able to. But most important, we must be strong here, strong in our hearts, strong in our souls, strong in our belief, and strong in our willingness to sacrifice, as you have been willing to sacrifice in a pecuniary way to serve in government. Something else I'd like for you to tell your young people. People often come in and say, what'll I tell my kids? They look at government and it's sort of a rugged life, and they see the mistakes that are made. They get the impression that everybody is here for the purpose of feathering his nest. That's why I made this earlier point. Not in this administration. Not one single man or woman. And I say to them, there are many fine careers. This country needs good farmers, good businessmen, good plumbers, good carpenters. I remember my old man. I think that they would have called him sort of a little man, a common man. He didn't consider himself that way. You know what he was? He was a streetcar motorman first, and then he was a farmer, and then he had a lemon ranch. It was the poorest lemon ranch in California, I can assure you. He sold it before they found oil on it. And then he was a grocer. But he was a great man. Because he did his job. And every job counts, up to the hilt, regardless of what happened. Nobody will ever write a book, probably, about my mother. Well, I guess all of you would say this about your mother. My mother was a saint. And I think of her, 2 boys dying of tuberculosis, nursing 4 others in order that she could take care of my older brother for 3 years in Arizona, and seeing each of them die, and when they died, it was like one of her own. Yes, she will have no books written about her. But she was a saint. Now, however, we look to the future. Had a little quote in a speech last night from T.R. As you know, I kind of like to read books. I'm not educated, but I do read books. And the T.R. quote was a pretty good one. There's another one I found as I was reading my last night in the White House. And this quote is about a young man. He was a young lawyer in New York. He'd married a beautiful girl. And they had a lovely daughter. And then suddenly, she died. And this is what he wrote. This was in his diary. He said, "She was beautiful in face and form, and lovelier still in spirit. As a flower she grew, and as a fair young flower she died. Her life had been always in the sunshine. There had never come to her a single great sorrow. None ever knew her who did not love and revere her for her bright and sunny temper and her saintly unselfishness. Fair, pure, and joyous as a maiden, loving, tender, and happy as a young wife. When she had just become a mother, when her life seemed to be just begun, and then the years seemed so bright before her, then by a strange and terrible fate, death came to her. And when my heart's dearest died, the light went from my life forever." That was T.R. in his 20s. He thought the life had gone from his life forever, but he went on. And he not only became president, but as an ex-president, he served his country, always in the arena, tempestuous, strong, sometimes wrong, sometimes right, but he was a man. And as I leave, let me say, that's an example I think all of us should remember. We think sometimes when things happen that don't go the right way, we think that when you don't pass the bar exam the first time, I happened to, but I was just lucky. I mean, my writing was so poor, the bar examiner said, we just got to let the guy through. We think that when someone dear to us dies, we think that when we lose an election, we think that when we suffer a defeat, that all is ended. We think, as T.R. said, that the light had left his life forever. Not true. It's only a beginning, always. The young must know it. The old must know it. It must always sustain us, because the greatness comes not when things go always good for you, but the greatness comes, and you're really tested, when you take some knocks, some disappointments, when sadness comes. Because only if you've been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain. And so I say to you on this occasion, we leave proud of the people who have stood by us and worked for us and served this country. We want you to be proud of what you've done. We want you to continue to serve in government if that is your wish. Always give your best. Never get discouraged. Never be petty. Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself. And so we leave with high hopes, in good spirit, and with deep humility, and with very much gratefulness in our hearts. I can only say to each and every one of you, we come from many faiths. We pray perhaps to different gods, but really the same God in a sense. But I want to say for each and every one of you, not only will we always remember you, not only will we always be grateful to you, but always you will be in our hearts, and you will be in our prayers. Thank you very much.
President Nixon in the White House East Room saying his goodbyes to members of the cabinet and ranking members of his staff. The schedule now calls for the president to go to the south lawn of the White House in a few moments to leave the White House for the last time as president.
And we understood earlier that the entire family would fly out to California with the president. We now are told that Julie and her husband, David Eisenhower, will not go to California, but are staying in Washington for the weekend at least. The exact complement that will fly out with him, other than Mr. Ziegler, we don't know unless you do there at the White House. There's some confusion over whether Chief of Staff General Alexander Haig will go with him or not. Do you know the answer to that?
No, we don't, Walter, and persistent questioning this morning did not produce the answer. I gather that General Haig, President Nixon's White House Chief of Staff, is torn between wanting to go to San Clemente with President Nixon on this last ride for Mr. Nixon as president and feeling the duty calls to stay at the White House and help as best he can the new President, Gerald Ford, on this his first day in office. So I don't know the answer to that question. The United States Marine Band plays as the invited guests, including Major General Scowcroft, who is at the bottom of your screen there for just a moment. Mr. Stein, the now retired chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and others file out of the room to wave goodbye to President Nixon on that takeoff from the White House South Lawn in a few moments. This is the south side of the White House, the side that faces the Washington Monument, Turning Basin, and the Lincoln Memorial, so-called Truman balcony up back behind the pillars, so-called because President Truman had the balcony put in when the White House was refurbished and remodeled in the late 1940s. The White House... Yes, Walter?
Excuse me. And there's the president coming out. I was going to say something else, but here he is on the South Lawn already.
They are emerging from the so-called diplomatic entrance downstairs.
There is the man who will be president in another couple of hours, Gerald Ford and his wife, Betty Ford. Phil Jones is on the South Lawn there. Phil?
Walter, as you can see, Mr. and Mrs. Ford have joined the Nixons as they make the last walk out to Army One, the helicopter, just before the Nixons appeared here at the South. Secretary came with tears in her eyes. Ron Ziegler, the press secretary, fighting back tears. The president's personal physician moved out ahead to get some pictures of Mr. Nixon as he leaves the White House here to board the helicopter for the flight to California. Vice President Ford this morning, as he left his home to come here for this occasion, said it was indeed one of the saddest incidents that he's ever seen. And there's the president waving goodbye, and you hear the applause.
Followed in by Tricia Nixon Cox and her husband, Edward Cox.
Dan, we'll be seeing the president again at Andrews Air Force Base. We are set up there, of course, and there will be another short farewell there as he transfers from the helicopter to an Air Force jet. Not, I gather, Air Force One after all. He's not taking the presidential plane Spirit of 76. At least that's the word as of this morning. That seems to have changed every hour since we knew he was resigning yesterday afternoon.
Well, I think, Walter, the case is very much as it was last evening, that Vice President Ford, soon to be the new president, made it clear that he would be happy to have President Nixon make the ride back to San Clemente aboard Air Force One, or this picture of some of the crowd at the White House, some of the staff members, cabinet members, lining the walls. That Vice President Ford made it clear he'd be happy to have the president fly on the number one Air Force plane, but President Nixon knows the value of the communications aboard Air Force One or the Spirit of 76, and there has been some confusion as to which aircraft he would use. They both are side by side out at Andrews Air Force Base, and we'll simply have to wait and see. President Nixon peering out from behind the bullet-resistant glass. Taken him back and forth on this trip as well as other trips. Vice President and Mrs. Ford. Also on the ground, Julie Nixon Eisenhower and her husband David. You perhaps saw David as the president stuck. After David stuck out, the president shook it warmly. It is a muggy, still day here along the mud flats. Leaves in the trees not moving back and forth. The air very heavy. Vice President and Mrs. Ford standing just to the left of Mr. and Mrs. Cox and just in front of that old magnolia tree that was planted by Andrew Jackson before he left. Members of Ford already started making their moves over to the White House. There are some of the President Nixon's helicopter going over the fountains of the White House South Lawn, over the back black fence, high over the ellipse. Toward the base of the Washington Monument.
And President Dan is getting his last look now as he peers back from that seat in the helicopter.
What a scene
of the
there,
White
Walter.
House as President of the United States. This will be the last look. By the time he comes back to this point, if indeed history decrees that he does at any point, he will, of course, no longer be the president.
Walter, what a sight it is. Of the Capitol, the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, and the Jefferson Memorial. From that height, height of, less than 500 feet, it is a tremendous view. And I'd have to say that if you were inside that helicopter with President Nixon this morning looking down on that, I don't doubt for a moment that you would find yourself saying, when the smoke clears from a lot of this, I'd like to come back. Siren happens just about this time of morning, almost every morning in front of the White House. I have a feeling that the boys wanted to go get a cup of coffee or something.
Bob Schieffer reports from Andrews Air Force Base, where we'll be picking up very shortly, that the plane the president is going to San Clemente on, if this is that important, we've spent much time with it, I think, is the Spirit of 76, is Air Force One, after all. The CBS News special report will continue in a moment.
You look sweet up on the seat of the bicycle built for two. You also look a little warm, Gloria.
And thirsty.
Well, we've got plenty of orange juice. Orange juice from Florida, over ice. It's a real thirst quencher. And because orange juice is 100% pure juice, it's the good-for-you summer refresher any place.
Any time of the day.
You bet. So come on, cool off under the Florida Sunshine Tree.
Yowza, yowza, on their feet for 1,000 hours. Just look at those wonderful kids dancing their way to fame and fortune. How do their feet stand the pace?
With Dr. Scholl's Air Pillow insoles, anybody's feet can feel fresher longer. Put a cushion of softness between you and the hard ground with Dr. Scholl's Air Pillow insoles.
Oh, look at them, folks, like they're dancing on air.
The helicopter flight from the White House to Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland is normally about 8 minutes long. The president took off just a couple of minutes ago. 6 minutes from now, he'll be arriving at Andrews Air Force Base. We might go out there now where Bob Schieffer is standing by, and he can give us an advance report from Andrews. Bob?
Walter, as you know, that's Air Force One, the plane that Mr. Nixon himself named the Spirit of 76. This particular aircraft is a fairly new one. It came into the inventory during Mr. Nixon's presidency. It is the aircraft that took him on his most recent trip to the Soviet Union. Andrews Air Force Base, of course, has been the scene of many presidential arrivals and departures over the years. The base was open to the public this morning, and about 2 hours ago, people began coming onto the airport apron. They're now positioned behind the fence just off the runway here, several hundred waiting to see Mr. Nixon leave Washington for the last time as president. The plan is that Mr. Nixon's helicopter will land just over here. He's expected to go directly to the plane with his family and with his aides, Presidential Press Secretary Ronald Ziegler and his appointment secretary, Stephen Bull. As it stands now, Mr. Nixon will be President of the United States when he boards this plane. About 2 hours after he is aloft, the oath of office will be given to Gerald Ford, and when this plane lands in California later today, Mr. Nixon will be Richard Nixon, private citizen. This is Bob Schieffer, CBS News at Andrews Air Force Base.
The President is en route to Andrews now, and this CBS News special report will continue in a moment.
Dale, why did they ask us to talk about Listerol spray disinfectant?
Count the reasons. 12 rooms, 6 kids, 15 grandchildren, horses, dogs. We used to use Lysol.
Till they proved Listerol is better. In laboratory tests, specially treated garbage germ cultures were sprayed with Lysol and Listerol. After 18 hours, odor-causing germs were growing back on the Lysol culture, but almost none on Listerols.
So we switched to Listerol.
Listerol, proven the better germ killer.
My opinion, the thicker the steak, the better. The same with the sauce. Thick like Heinz 57. Hi, I'm Chef Mike Roy. Put Heinz 57 next to this other leading steak sauce. See, this sauce is thin, runs, separates. But Heinz stays thick and rich, with a spicy flavor you can get your teeth into. Heinz 57. The thicker, the better.
While we await to report the final farewell, President Nixon from Washington, that is, from nearby Andrews Air Force Base, we can also look for a moment at the upcoming momentous day for Vice President Ford, who is to become President of the United States in less than 2 hours. And Phil Jones has a look now at what's coming up for Mr. Ford on this day.
Ceremony, as we all know, will occur at 12 noon. At this particular moment, the Vice President and Mrs. Ford are inside the White House. They went inside as the helicopter left with President Nixon. They went inside with Julie and David Eisenhower. You really couldn't see the scene here. The picture, of course, was that one of Army One with the President leaving for the final time. But rather touching back here as Julie waved goodbye, David Eisenhower holding Julie, trying to console her. Walter?
Arriving now at Andrews. Quickly, can you tell us, is Mr. Ford going to move into the White House today? Are they going to spend the night there, do you know? I'm sorry, Phil, I'm not hearing you. I don't know if the audio's cut through or not. We'll get back to that a little later. Let's go now to Andrews Air Force Base. We can see the picture. Bob Schieffer is there.
Walter, one of the presidential helicopters has just landed behind the Spirit of 76. It's just now setting down. They have not yet turned off the engines. And I'm not sure that is the helicopter that the president is aboard. It may well be. But it just landed here just a few minutes ago, and I'm just not sure that the president's helicopter has had time to get here yet. This may be one of the backup birds, well, you can see it there in your picture now. It's taxiing over. It may well be. It may well be Mr. Nixon's plane. This is certainly one of those helicopters in the fleet, and the way it's pulling into position now. I'm trying to see in those windows to see if I can see if this is the one that Mr. Nixon is aboard. This is certainly the spot that where the helicopter parks when Mr. Nixon is aboard. cranking down the engines now. And this is the one. This is the plane. Secret Service man who just came down the ramp. Mrs. Nixon waiting at the door, apparently waiting for the president. And here comes Mr. Nixon. I would say 300 or 400 people back behind the ropes now to see Mr. Nixon off. And they are giving him a nice round of applause.
That's the commandant of Andrews Air Force Base with him, I believe, is it not, Bob?
I'm sorry, Walter, I didn't hear you.
I say that's the commandant of Andrews Air Force
Yes, it
Base
is.
with him, I believe, Commander.
Edward Cox, the president's son-in-law. We said just a moment ago, of course, this base has been the scene of many presidential arrivals and departures over the years, never one quite like this. Again, a scene we've seen many times at this air base just south of Washington in the Maryland suburbs. Presidential aides are putting suitcases on board. Presidential Press Secretary Ronald Ziegler, Stephen Bull are getting aboard the plane at the rear entrance. Only the president and his immediate family boarded at the front entrance. There had been some speculation that the president might say a word or two here, but that was not the case. This is going to be a very fast departure, obviously. So Mr. Nixon will be about halfway across the United States if the schedule holds when Gerald Ford is sworn in as President of the United States. That trip to California will be about 4.5 to 5 hours. It's about 10:15 now Eastern Standard Time. So about noon, Mr. Nixon will be over the heartland of the United States en route to the El Toro Marine Base in California. Walter, they tell me that the base out there is going to be open to the public. Many times when Mr. Nixon came there as president, that base was always closed off, sealed off for security reasons. I'm told that like security regulations here at Andrews today, that base will be open for those who want to come and see the president arrive. Now the big plane pulling away from the apron here at Andrews. This is the first time that a president has ever left office voluntarily. So this is truly a historic moment that we're seeing as this big aircraft pulls away from the apron here at Andrews. No, I was just thinking, Walter, watching all of this morning, so many things that we've seen before here, and yet it was all so different. Mr. Nixon boarded the plane. He turned to the crowd and gave that big wave that that he always gave. Mrs. Nixon seemed in good spirits. It was the same sort of departure. The base officials here shake hands with the president as he left. The base commander always comes out to say goodbye to the president when he leaves, and always comes out to say hello when he returns. We've seen returns from many parts of the world at this base over the Nixon presidency. He returned here after the trip to China, after the trip to the Soviet Union.
Bob, as we watch the plane roll out to the end of the runway and carry President Nixon away from Washington for the last time, by the time he arrives in San Clemente, 5 hours or so from now, he will be private citizen. Nixon, we might recall the words of President Truman after he left office, and he left, of course, under vastly different circumstances than Mr. Nixon is leaving. But even so, President Truman said at that time, most people never stop to think about what happens to a man who's been President of the United States. The day he's elected president, he suddenly finds himself at the top of the world, where he sits for a while holding the destinies of millions in his hands, making decisions that change the course of history, conferring with rulers and the leaders of nations. Then, just as suddenly, he is again at the level of John Jones, who lives next door. We believe that anybody can be President of the United States, and that when he is through, he can go back to being just anybody again. It's not been that simple for me. Back home in Independence, I discovered that it was not easy to assume the role of Mr. Citizen. It's going to be, those are the words, of course, of Harry S. Truman, spoken some years ago. He left office in 1953. But it's going to be somewhat more difficult even for President Nixon assuming that role of Mr. Citizen, because he faces innumerable problems in that new role. Not the least of those is whether or not he himself might face criminal charges in the future. The grand jury, which named him a unindicted co-conspirator in the Watergate cover-up case because it was advised that to do otherwise would involve constitutional issues that would only delay the case, is still sitting in Washington. And as the president leaves Washington in that Air Force One, the Spirit of 76, that grand jury is still meeting and could indeed change its mind and now indict him, although there's been no suggestion as yet that that will be the course. But Special Prosecutor Jaworski said that there has been no deal made, no promise of immunity, and he volunteered that statement last night.
Well, he's airborne now, Walter. At about 10:19, Air Force One left Andrews Air Force Base for the last time with Richard Nixon as President of the United States.
The report will continue in a moment.
If I asked you, does one potato chip taste better than another? You'd say, nah, you taste one, you've tasted them all. And if I said, the Chippos taste better and I can prove it, you'd say, prove it. Ordinary potato chips fry in oil about 2 to 3 minutes, leaving this behind, oil. Chippos are fashioned from dried potatoes and flash fried. Look, less oil on the outside. So if you taste less oil, you've got to taste more potato chip.
I remember Grandma and how good her country fried chicken tasted, tender and juicy inside, crisp outside. Now I get country fried chicken taste without frying, with new Betty Crocker crisp and tender batter mix. Nobody knows batter better than Betty Crocker. Crisp and tender bakes chicken, golden crisp outside, tender and juicy inside.
Tastes like your grandma used to make.
Country fried chicken taste without frying, now with crisp and tender.
Richard Nixon, who last night announced to the nation his intention to resign, has another hour and 40 minutes in office before the resignation will become effective at noon. And a short while ago, we saw his last talk as the President of the United States when he said farewell to his staff and the cabinet in the East Room of the White House. It was a 17-minute, 40-second, quite emotional speech in which the president cried. We saw the tears in his eyes and the sob in his voice, particularly when he spoke of his father, and even more particularly when he spoke of his mother, who he referred to as a saint, and his father as, while a business failure, a great man because he tried. His mother, incidentally, died in 1967 at the age of 82. The president's emotion came through clearly in these last moments in the White House. He spoke emotionally of his last night in the White House and reading from Theodore Roosevelt after Roosevelt's young daughter had died, and how that seemed to be the end of the world, but that the world did go on, and that T.R. went on to become President of the United States, and he suggested that he would be facing the same sort of depths at this moment, but would climb to the heights again, he even said. And he did say that this is not goodbye, but au revoir, we will be back. The emotion that the president showed today also came out last night. We have only learned today. Apparently at the White House, just before he made that exceedingly calm appearance, although clearly choking back emotion, in his speech last night on television, just before that he met with the leaders of the Congress, and we're told that at the end of that talk to them, he broke down and sobbed unashamedly, and all the strong men in the room wept with him. What happened in the confines of the family in the White House, we have only been told, we have not been told that he cried in that occasion, but perhaps we haven't been told at all. Eric, it was quite an emotional speech this morning.
Yes, I'm sure he was, must be half exhausted for one thing, but it was very much what we have heard from Mr. Nixon at climactic moments in his career now over many years. Very powerful echoes there of the whole emotional overtone of the Chequers speech, of his speech in '62 when he was defeated in California. He is an emotional man. He represses it most of the time, and then when it comes out, it's a little hard to control. He broke down, I'm told, in the morning of the election in '60 when he lost to Mr. Kennedy, just for time went to pieces. The explanation of this man and what has happened to him, I think eventually is going to have to be left to people who write and think in psychological terms. There really isn't any other way to get at the final truth of it. As one White House official said to me yesterday, this is a case of psychic suicide. He has done this to himself for reasons maybe we won't all fully understand. He will speak in the accents of greatness, which he has done time and again. The contrast between the words and what we now know from many years of experience with Mr. Nixon as a reality is always what surprises and baffles me. He has talked again about the lack of bitterness. He's talked in the tones of magnanimity, but you know that the bitterness is deep in him. You know that his hatred of certain people and things like the press or parts of it is a profound and lifetime thing. And so you constantly have the contrast of the right words, and yet you know that something else is going on in his breast all the time.
Eric, there was that dichotomy this morning in the talk again when he said that millions may hate you, but they lose for that. But if you hate them, you are lost. And yet, I think many analysts have pointed out that it has been his hate and bitterness against his political enemies that has really brought him down. It's the sort of meaning of Watergate.
Yes, I think so. I think... I've forgotten what I was going to say at the moment, but there is, in a funny way, a self-destructive thing in Mr. Nixon, and we're all playing like amateur psychiatrists here, and perhaps we shouldn't, but it's as though he has needed enemies from the beginning, not only for political reasons, but to give him his own identity. I have heard psychiatrists talk about this. I happen to think they're right. This is This is a young man who grew up in a rootless culture and a place, all these great tragedies in his family life that he has referred to this morning. He never knew really who he was. We have heard over and over that what a strong man he is. I think he's a very tough man. Strong in the sense of being self-confident, I think he is not and has never been. I've heard from many of his associates, even in the last few years, about his profound insecurities. They are there. He's overcome them to make this astonishing career, and that is something. But it's as though he needs enemies to feel who he is.
The special report will continue in a moment.
No country's got the beauty, the light, the music that we've got. And we've got the best drink to go with it all. Have a Coke and start looking up.
Look up, America, see what we got. Let in the sunny side of living. Look for the best, yeah, look at refresh. Look for the real thing. Like Coca-Cola. It's the real thing.
Cookies. Grease-stained overalls? I can't clean these grimy kids' clothes all alone. I need help.
Kids' clothes too tough for you?
Who are you?
I'm Magic. Magic Pre-Wash. Those stains can't resist me. Spray me on. Wait a minute or two and wash as usual. Magic Pre-Wash is made especially to loosen tough stains kids grind in.
You're right.
I'm Magic.
Magic Pre-Wash with lemon fragrance. Loosens stains like magic.
Dan, we have refrained from referring to it here, but this must be something of an emotional moment for you. You have covered the entire Nixon presidency and have been in the forefront of some of the conflict between the press and the president. I wonder what your thoughts were as you...
No bitterness, Walter. No joy about any of it. I did have the feeling that in my own reporting and perhaps some of the other reporting we did this morning that looking back on it, we're perhaps a little too venereal. And there was, always there is surrounding the presidency a certain amount of majesty. But this was not a case of a hero saying goodbye. Again, we have to yank ourselves back into reality. There is some exuberance, I would say, in general, in the tone and the mood of the people, the tourists who are around the White House. And I would have to say in all candor, I don't want to be hypocritical about it, that I share that exuberance only in this sense. The process worked. The constitutional process worked. The system worked. And in this country, that's the way things are done. And my own feelings are those of sadness, no bitterness, and some exuberance about the great American experiment showing that it's still strong and healthy and viable. Walter?
Washington for the last time as President of the United States. In an hour and a half now, President Gerald Ford, who was handpicked by his vice president 8 months ago after the resignation of Spiro Agnew, that under the 25th Amendment, will take the oath of office as the 38th President of the United States to serve out months of the term that President Nixon is abandoning under the pressure of the Watergate scandals, and perhaps then to run for his own term in office. First President of the United States not elected by the people, either as President or as Vice President. We'll be back at time with the swearing in of Gerald Ford, the 8th President of the United States. CBS News in Washington.
This has been a CBS News special report. This is CBS.